Right now, 14 strangers are trampling my front lawn, setting up tents by the lake, and brazenly hanging a Happy Birthday Susie banner like this is some kind of public park. I've never heard the name Susie in my life, and I certainly didn't invite them because this land is the lake ranch my family has owned since my great-grandfather's time. But Karen, the HOA president, told them they had permission to party here, and when I asked them to leave, she called 911 to report me for harassing her guests. That very call would unearth a secret about land usage rights that Karen had no idea she had just buried herself with. This story starts with a birthday party and ends with an entire HOA collapsing in a single night. Where are you watching from? Comment below because you're about to witness the most epic HOA takedown in history. The whole mess started on what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning. I was out fixing the fence line that separates my property from the main road, something I'd been putting off since moving back to Grandpa Silas's place 8 months ago. The rhythmic hammering was therapeutic, a way to keep my hands busy while my mind wandered to memories of summers spent here as a kid. Grandpa had passed away last winter, leaving me this beautiful 15-acre spread with about 200 feet of pristine lake frontage, and honestly, I was still getting used to the idea that it was mine now. As a freelance software engineer, I could work from anywhere, so when the grief of losing the only family member who truly understood me became too much to bear in my cramped city apartment, I packed up and moved to the place that held my happiest childhood memories. That's when I heard the voices. Way too many voices for a Saturday morning in what was supposed to be the quiet countryside. I dropped my hammer and walked toward the sound, emerging from behind a cluster of old oak trees to see something that made my blood pressure spike instantly. A group of people, mostly middle-aged women with a few kids running around, had somehow gotten onto my property and were in the process of turning my lakefront into their personal party venue. They'd brought folding tables, coolers, what looked like a bouncy castle that was half inflated, and enough decorations to stock a party supply store. The birthday banner was strung between two of my grandfather's hand-planted willow trees, and I watched in horrified fascination as a woman in a bright pink tracksuit directed two teenagers to move my grandfather's wooden dock chairs to make room for their setup. I took a deep breath, channeling the patience Grandpa Silas had always shown when dealing with difficult people, and walked over to what appeared to be the group's organizer. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level and polite. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is private property, and I'm going to need you all to pack up and find another location for your party." The woman in the pink tracksuit looked me up and down like I was some kind of vagrant who'd wandered onto her territory. "Oh, you must be the new guy," she said with a dismissive wave. "Don't worry about it, sweetie. We have permission from the HOA to use this space for community events. Karen Westfield herself sent us the email approval." She pulled out her phone and showed me what looked like an official email with Lakeside Meadows HOA letterhead, giving full permission for Susie Miller's 12th birthday celebration to use the community lakefront area. That's when I noticed something that made my contractor instincts kick in. They had cut the lock on my private gate and somehow forced it open to get their vehicles in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding about public space versus private property. This was straight-up trespassing. I was about to explain this when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on gravel behind me. "Is there a problem here?" The voice dripped with authority and barely concealed irritation. I turned to see a woman in her late 40s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wearing what probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, striding toward us like she owned the place. This had to be Karen Westfield, the HOA president I'd heard whispers about but never actually met. She had the kind of presence that screamed "I speak to managers for sport" and the confident stride of someone who was used to getting her way through sheer force of personality. "I'm Marcus Thornfield," I said, extending my hand in what I hoped was a neighborly gesture. "I inherited this property from my grandfather, Silas Thornfield, and I was just explaining to these folks that this is private land." Karen's expression shifted slightly when I mentioned my grandfather's name. Something flickered across her face too quickly for me to read, but she recovered immediately. "Oh, Marcus, yes, I've been meaning to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about property lines. According to our HOA agreements and the community usage clauses established over the past 20 years, this lakefront area has been designated for community recreational use. I have all the proper documentation if you'd like to review it." The way she said it, with such confident authority, made me wonder for a split second if I'd somehow misunderstood my inheritance, but then I remembered the stack of legal documents, surveys, and deed transfers that had taken weeks to sort through with the estate lawyer. "I appreciate the welcome," I replied, "but I've seen all the documentation for this property, and I can assure you that every square inch of this land, including the lakefront, is privately owned by the Thornfield family and has been since 1924. These folks are going to need to find another location. That's when Karen's mask slipped completely. Her voice rose just enough to carry to the party group, who had stopped their setup to watch our increasingly tense conversation. Mr. Thornfield, I understand you're new here and probably don't understand how things work in our community, but we have established usage rights that supersede individual property claims. These people have every right to be here, and frankly, your aggressive attitude toward community members is exactly the kind of behavior our HOA was created to prevent. She pulled out her phone with theatrical flair and began dialing. If you continue to harass our residents and their guests, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a woman calling the police on me for asking trespassers to leave my property. But something in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty when I'd mentioned the 1924 date, told me she wasn't as confident about her legal standing as she was pretending to be. I could have escalated, could have demanded they leave immediately and threatened to call the police myself, but something Grandpa Silas used to say echoed in my mind. Sometimes the best way to catch a liar is to let them dig their own grave. So instead of arguing, I simply smiled and said, "You know what, Karen? Go ahead and make that call. I think having an official record of this situation would be beneficial for everyone involved." When Karen grappled 911 to report me for harassing guests, she had no idea that call would trigger a chain of events my grandfather had been preparing for 30 years. As I watched her speak to the dispatcher, her voice, taking on that particular tone people use when they want to sound like the victim, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and uncertainty I'd been carrying since Grandpa's death was being replaced by something else. A determination to protect not just the land he'd left me, but the legacy of integrity he'd spent his whole life building. Little did Karen know that when Sheriff Roy Hutchins received that call and heard the address Thornfield Ranch, he'd remember a promise he'd made to a dying old man about watching out for his grandson. The way Sheriff Roy Hutchins looked at me when he stepped out of his patrol car, like he'd just seen a ghost, I knew immediately there was something about my family that I hadn't been told. Karen had positioned herself strategically near her car, phone still in hand, probably recording everything for her inevitable social media campaign, while the birthday party guests clustered together like confused sheep watching their shepherds argue. Roy was a tall, weathered man in his mid-50s, with the kind of steady presence that comes from decades of dealing with people's worst moments, but as his eyes met mine, I saw something I wasn't expecting. Genuine emotion. "Marcus Thornfield," he said. And it wasn't a question. His voice carried a weight that suggested my name meant something to him, something significant. "You look just like your grandfather did at your age." Silas was, well, he was a good man. The way he said it, with a slight catch in his voice, told me this wasn't just professional courtesy. Karen must have sensed she was losing control of the narrative because she immediately inserted herself between us, her voice taking on that practiced victim tone I was already learning to recognize. "Sheriff Hutchins, thank goodness you're here. Mr. Thornfield has been extremely aggressive toward our community members and is refusing to allow a simple children's birthday party to continue on community property." She gestured dramatically toward the party setup as if she were presenting evidence at trial. "We have all the proper permissions from the HOA, and his behavior is frankly disturbing. These poor children just want to celebrate, and he's creating a hostile environment." Roy listened patiently, his expression neutral, but I caught him glancing around the property with what looked like familiarity. When Karen finished her performance, he turned back to me with something that might have been an apologetic smile. "Marcus, I knew your grandfather for over 40 years, Roy said, his voice careful and measured. "He saved my life when I was 12 years old, pulled me out of this very lake when I got caught in a riptide during a storm. Been like a father to me ever since." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa Silas had never mentioned saving anyone's life, never talked about being close to any local law enforcement, but suddenly so many things made sense. The way Roy had said my grandfather's name, the emotion in his eyes, the careful way he was handling this situation. "Now, I need to be clear about something," Roy continued, his voice taking on a more official tone. "I can't just order people off property without clear evidence of ownership and trespassing. Even though I know this land has been in your family for generations, I need you to provide official documentation of your property boundaries and ownership rights within the next 48 hours. Karen's face lit up with what she thought was victory, but Roy wasn't finished. "However," he said, turning toward the party group, "until this matter is resolved, I'm going to need everyone to suspend activities on this disputed property. That means no more setup, no more party, and no more cutting locks on private gates." His eyes found Karen's with laser precision. "Yes, ma'am, I noticed the bolt cutters in the back of that SUV and the freshly cut lock by the entrance. Destroying someone else's property to gain access is trespassing at minimum, potentially breaking, depending on intent. The confident smirk disappeared from Karen's face so quickly that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Roy's radio crackled, and he stepped away for a moment to respond, giving Karen just enough time to lean toward me with an expression of pure venom. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Marcus," she hissed, her composed facade completely gone. "This community has certain expectations, certain ways of doing things that have been established long before you showed up. 3 families in the past 2 years have found it much easier to relocate than to fight the inevitable." The threat was barely veiled, and something cold settled in my stomach. "I'd hate for you to make the same mistakes they did." Before I could respond, Roy returned, and Karen's mask of concerned community leader snapped back into place like she'd flipped a switch. It was unsettling how quickly she could transform from threatening neighbor to worried citizen, and I made a mental note to be very careful about any future interactions with this woman. Roy approached me with something that looked like reluctance, glancing around to make sure Karen was out of earshot before speaking in a low voice. "Marcus, your grandfather, he called me about 6 months before he passed. Said some things about this property, about people who might try to cause trouble after he was gone." His eyes found mine with an intensity that made me pay attention. "He told me that if you ever needed help with land disputes, I should remind you to check the basement safe. Said you'd know what he meant by that, and that everything you'd need would be there." The words hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa Silas had known this day was coming, had somehow anticipated that someone would challenge my ownership of the family land. But how could he have known about Karen specifically? And what exactly was waiting for me in that basement safe? Roy handed me his card with a number written on the back. "That's my personal cell. Your grandfather was the closest thing to a father I ever had after my dad died, and I owe him more than I can ever repay. Whatever's coming, whatever fight this turns into, you're not facing it alone." As he walked back toward his patrol car, Karen made one last attempt to salvage her position. "Sheriff, surely you're not going to let this man intimidate honest community members," she called out. But Roy just shook his head. "Ma'am, I suggest you consult your HOA bylaws and any legal documentation you have regarding property usage rights. 48 hours, folks. Everyone needs to clear out until this gets resolved properly." After the last car pulled away, and the birthday party supplies were grudgingly packed up, I stood alone on my grandfather's land, Roy's words echoing in my mind. The basement safe had been locked since I'd moved in, an old combination lock that I'd assumed contained financial documents or family heirloom. But now, with the memory of Grandpa Silas's careful planning and Roy's urgent message, I realized it might contain something much more important, the key to understanding exactly what kind of battle I was about to face. What I found when I opened that basement safe wasn't just proof of ownership, but evidence of a systematic conspiracy to reclaim private land that had been going on for decades. The combination turned out to be Grandpa Silas's birthday, something so obvious I felt foolish for not trying it sooner. But as the heavy door swung open, I understood why he'd kept this particular collection of documents separate from everything else. Inside was an old Panasonic tape recorder from the 1990s, the kind with actual cassette tapes, along with a manila folder thick enough to use as a doorstop and a handwritten note in my grandfather's careful script that simply read, "For Marcus, when the wolves come for our land, everything you need is here. Trust the evidence. Trust Roy, and remember that justice delayed is not justice denied. Love, Grandpa Silas." My hands were shaking as I lifted out the tape recorder. Something about the weight of it and the deliberate way it had been placed, suggesting this wasn't just family memorabilia. I pressed play on the first tape, and suddenly my grandfather's voice filled the basement, younger and stronger than I remembered, but unmistakably his. The 15th of June, 1995. Recording the emergency HOA meeting called by Karen Westfield regarding the Lakefront Development Initiative. My blood went cold. Karen had been plotting this for almost 30 years, and somehow my grandfather had known to document it. The recording quality was surprisingly good, and I could hear multiple voices, including one that was a younger version of Karen's distinctive tone. "The Thornfield property represents the largest obstacle to our development goals," her voice crackled through the old speakers. "If we can establish community usage patterns over the next 20 years, we'll have grounds for adverse possession claims. The key is documentation and consistent encroachment." Another voice, male and unfamiliar, responded with something that made my stomach turn. "Meridian Development is prepared to compensate the HOA handsomely for facilitating access to that lakefront. We're talking about a resort that could bring millions in revenue to this area." As I listened to more of the tape, a picture emerged of a carefully orchestrated plan that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Karen wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was the local facilitator for a much larger development scheme that involved gradually undermining property rights through manufactured community claim. My grandfather had been playing a much longer game than I'd realized, and now it was time for me to continue what he'd started. Karen thought she was clever launching her online campaign, but she forgot that I'm the guy who designs security systems for banks. While she was busy spinning her victim narrative on Facebook, I was quietly building something that would make her social media offensive look like bringing a water gun to a missile fight. .org petition titled, "Save Our Community Lake from Corporate Greed," which somehow painted me as a wealthy outsider trying to privatize community resources for profit. The petition gained several hundred signatures in the first day, mostly from people who had no idea what the facts were. But the comments section became a battleground between residents who knew the Thornfield family history and newcomers who believed Karen's spin. Using the same forensic techniques I developed for tracking financial fraud, I started analyzing the social media accounts supporting her petition and quickly discovered something that made me smile for the first time in days. 17 of the most vocal supporters weren't real people at all. They were sock puppet accounts created from the same IP address, Karen's office computer. She arrived unannounced with a manila envelope full of photographs and a story that made my chest tight with emotion. "Your great-grandmother helped my family when we first came to America," she said in accented but clear English. "We had nothing, and the Thornfield family gave my husband work building their dock and fixing their fence. These pictures show your family's kindness to many people over the years." The photos were incredible. Black and white images from the 1960s showing community gatherings on our property, but clearly as guests, not people asserting usage rights. There were pictures of my grandparents hosting church picnics, allowing local kids to use the lake for swimming lessons, and even letting a young family camp on the property during a house fire emergency. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears as she pointed to a photo of her late husband shaking hands with my grandfather. "Your family never charged money, never asked for anything except respect for the land." The real breakthrough came when I received an anonymous email with a subject line that made my heart race: Meridian Development's insurance policy. The message was brief and cryptic, but it included a PDF attachment that was pure gold, an insurance document showing that Meridian had purchased a specialized political risk policy to protect their investment in the Lakeside Resort project. The policy specifically covered losses due to unexpected legal challenges to property acquisition and was worth $2.5 million, which told me exactly how much money was at stake in Karen's schemes. More importantly, the policy documents included a detailed project timeline that showed Karen had promised to deliver clear title to lakefront properties by the end of this year, explaining her increasingly desperate behavior. Emma's reaction to the insurance documents was immediate and intense. "This changes everything," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Insurance fraud is a federal crime, and if they filed false claims about property ownership to get this policy, we're not just looking at local HOA corruption anymore. This could involve the FBI." As if the universe were determined to prove her point, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was carefully neutral, but carried an authority that made me pay attention. "Mr. Thornfield, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's White Collar Crime Division. I understand you may have information relevant to an ongoing investigation into real estate fraud. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning?" The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, which meant someone else was already investigating Meridian Development, and our little property dispute had just become part of something much bigger. "Hey everyone, this is Ryan Carter from San Diego, California, currently writing stories for the Loop Stories channel. If you're enjoying this story, please drop a flower emoji in the comments below." The mysterious person who called themselves a friend of Silas didn't just bring the final piece of evidence I needed. They revealed exactly how far Karen was willing to go to get her hands on this land. Harold Grayson showed up at my door just as the morning fog was lifting off the lake, a frail man in his 70s, with intelligent eyes and the careful movements of someone who'd been looking over his shoulder for too long. "I was the HOA president before Karen," he said without preamble, "and I've been carrying the weight of my cowardice for 15 years. Your grandfather tried to warn me about what she was planning, but I was too scared of the consequences to listen." The shame in his voice was palpable, and as he settled into my grandfather's old rocking chair on the porch, I could see this was a man who'd been wrestling with guilt for a very long time. Harold's story unfolded like a masterclass in psychological manipulation and community terrorism. Karen hadn't just threatened legal action against those who opposed her. She'd orchestrated a campaign of harassment that included anonymous complaints to tax assessors, mysterious problems with utility services, and social ostracism that effectively drove families out of the area. "The Morrison family fought her for 2 years, Harold said, his hands shaking slightly as he opened a weathered briefcase. Suddenly, their property taxes tripled due to a mysterious reassessment. Their septic system failed inspection for violations that didn't exist 6 months earlier, and their teenage daughter started getting bullied at school by kids whose parents supported Karen. They sold their lake house for half its value just to escape the pressure. 3 other families had suffered similar fates, and Harold had the documentation to prove it, county records showing suspicious patterns of violations and reassessments that perfectly aligned with Karen's acquisition timeline. The recordings Harold brought were even more damning than the ones my grandfather had hidden in the basement safe. Using an old flip phone with a surprisingly good microphone, Harold had captured phone conversations where Karen explicitly discussed bribes to county officials and threatened to make life unbearable for anyone who interfered with her plans. The most chilling recording was from just 2 months ago, Karen's voice discussing me specifically. "The Thornfield kid won't know what hit him. We'll start with social pressure, escalate to regulatory harassment, and if that doesn't work, Meridian has contacts who can create more serious problems. Nobody fights us successfully, Harold, because we control too many levers of power." The casual way she discussed destroying people's lives was breathtaking, and I finally understood why Harold had been too terrified to speak up sooner. Emma's reaction to Harold's evidence was immediate and strategic. Instead of another podcast episode, she suggested we host a community truth session at my property, essentially an informal town hall where neighbors could hear the evidence firsthand and ask questions. "Karen's been using isolation and misinformation to control people," Emma explained as we planned the event. "The best way to break that power is transparency and community engagement." We sent invitations through the local paper and social media, framing it as an educational session about property rights and HOA governance. Within hours, we had commitments from over 40 residents, including several I recognized from Karen's petition supporters. Apparently, Harold's testimony had shaken some people's confidence in their HOA president. Sheriff Roy's official statement at the truth session carried the weight of law enforcement credibility that no amount of social media spin could undermine. Standing in front of the gathered crowd with his official report in hand, Roy methodically explained exactly what crimes had been committed on my property. "The individuals who held the birthday party engaged in criminal trespassing by cutting a private lock and entering gated property without permission," he announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Furthermore, our investigation has revealed a pattern of fraudulent documentation designed to create false claims of community usage rights." When someone from the audience asked about Karen's assertion that the HOA had legitimate authority over the lakefront, Roy's response was definitive. "The Thornfield family has maintained continuous ownership of this property since 1924, with no gaps in title and no legitimate adverse possession claims. Any suggestion otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately false." The community's reaction was swift and decisive. Mrs. Patterson, who'd signed Karen's petition just days earlier, stood up and publicly apologized for believing lies about my family. "I've lived here for 30 years, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "And I remember when the Thornfields hosted the annual church picnic right here by this lake. They never charged anyone, never restricted access, but they also never gave up ownership. Karen lied to all of us." One by one, other residents began sharing their own stories, memories of my grandparents' generosity that directly contradicted Karen's narrative of selfish property hoarding. The mood shifted palpably as people realized they'd been manipulated into supporting something that went against their own community's values and history. But Karen wasn't about to go quietly into the night. Just as the truth session was winding down and people were beginning to leave, her black Mercedes pulled into my driveway with 2 passengers I didn't recognize. Karen emerged from the driver's seat looking like she was dressed for battle, wearing what appeared to be an expensive business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed legal documentation. The 2 men with her had the unmistakable bearing of attorneys, and the grim expressions on their faces suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Marcus Thornfield," Karen announced in a voice loud enough to carry to the departing crowd, "you are hereby served with a cease and desist order for defamation, harassment, and intentional interference with business relationships. This community gathering constitutes a clear violation of the temporary restraining order we filed this afternoon." The papers she thrust at me were official court documents, and my heart sank as I realized she'd managed to convince a judge to grant her at least temporary legal protection from our truth-telling campaign. Karen thought she was winning when she arrived with those court papers, but she had no idea that while she was convincing a judge to grant her temporary protection, Emma was sitting in the district attorney's office with every piece of evidence we'd collected. The cease and desist order felt like a physical blow when I read through the legalese, essentially prohibiting me from discussing the property dispute publicly, hosting gatherings on my land, or interfering with normal HOA operations. The 2 lawyers flanking Karen looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate law firm, expensive suits and briefcases that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and their presence was designed to intimidate not just me, but the remaining community members who were still lingering after our truth session. My chest felt tight as I processed what this restraining order could mean, not just for my ability to defend my property, but for my entire future in this community. Karen had essentially weaponized the legal system to silence me, and for a moment, I wondered if I was about to lose everything my grandfather had worked his entire life to build. The stress of the past week, combined with the grief I was still carrying from losing the only family member who'd ever really understood me, crashed over me like a wave, and I felt my knees wobble. But then I caught sight of Harold Grayson's face in the crowd, the determination and resolve that had replaced his earlier shame. And I remembered that this fight wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had destroyed other families, and would continue destroying families if we didn't stop it here and now. That's when Sheriff Roy's patrol car pulled into the driveway, followed by a black SUV that screamed federal law enforcement. Roy emerged from his vehicle with a grim expression, and what looked like official paperwork in his hand, while two people in suits got out of the SUV and approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Karen Westfield," Roy announced in his official voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." The warrant he displayed was signed by a federal judge, and the FBI agents who flanked him began reading Karen her rights as her confident expression crumbled into something approaching panic. The search of Karen's vehicle revealed exactly what Emma had predicted we'd find. 2 sets of financial records showing her real income from Meridian Development, alongside the sanitized version she'd been reporting to the IRS. Hidden in her lawyer's briefcase was a USB drive containing what FBI agent Chen later described as a comprehensive manual for property acquisition through manufactured legal claims. The documents outlined step-by-step instructions for creating fake community usage patterns, bribing county officials to manipulate tax assessments, and using social pressure to force property owners into below-market sales. Most damning of all was a detailed backup plan for dealing with resistant property owners that included falsifying environmental violations and, in extreme cases, what they euphemistically called physical persuasion. The revelation that sent shockwaves through everyone present was when Agent Chen announced that David Park, one of Karen's lawyers, was an undercover investigator for the State Bar Association who'd been building a case against Karen's operation for over a year. Miss Westfield's organization has been under federal investigation since 2022, Agent Chen explained to the stunned crowd when a pattern of suspicious property transfers in 3 states caught our attention. Mr. Park volunteered to go undercover when we learned that Karen was planning to escalate her methods in response to increased scrutiny. The look of absolute betrayal on Karen's face when she realized one of her lawyers had been working against her was almost comical if the circumstances weren't so serious. But the biggest bombshell came when Agent Chen revealed that Meridian Development wasn't just being investigated for real estate fraud. They were part of a multi-state FBI operation targeting organized crime infiltration of the construction and development industry. What started as local HOA corruption has led us to a criminal organization with connections in 7 states, she announced, her words carrying the weight of a major federal case. Miss Westfield's cooperation in this matter could significantly impact her sentencing, but the evidence we've gathered today suggests that cooperation may not be necessary for successful prosecution. The implication was clear. Karen's entire operation was so thoroughly documented that even without her testimony, the government had everything they needed to dismantle the entire network. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, her expensive suit wrinkled, and her perfect composure completely shattered, the community members who remained began processing what they'd just witnessed. The cease and desist order that had seemed so threatening just an hour earlier was now meaningless, superseded by federal criminal charges that made Karen's civil lawsuit look like a playground dispute. Several neighbors approached me with apologies and offers of support, and I could see the relief in their faces as they realized they were finally free from the fear and manipulation that had controlled their community for so many years. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly as she hugged me, whispering, "Your grandfather would be so proud," in a voice thick with emotion. But even as I savored the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served, Agent Chen's words echoed in my mind about the larger criminal organization that Karen had been working with. This victory felt complete and overwhelming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be one more surprise waiting in the wings, one final twist that would determine whether this was the end of the story or just the end of the first chapter in a much larger battle for justice. What County Commissioner Janet Williams told me at 6 in the morning didn't just change the fate of my ranch, It created a precedent that would reshape property rights protection across the entire state. Her call woke me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in over a week, but the excitement in her voice made it clear this wasn't bad news. "Marcus, the governor's office has been following your case through the FBI investigation, and they want to use your situation as the foundation for comprehensive HOA reform legislation," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They're calling it the Property Rights Protection Act, and it would essentially make what Karen did to you and those other families a felony with mandatory minimum sentences." The idea that my grandfather's land, which had caused so much pain and conflict, might become the catalyst for protecting other families from similar abuse felt like the kind of poetic justice he would have appreciated. The emergency county hearing that morning was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, less like a typical government meeting and more like a celebration of justice finally served. The courtroom was packed with residents from not just our community but neighboring towns where similar HOA schemes had been reported, people who'd been afraid to speak up until they saw what had happened to Karen. Commissioner Williams opened the session by reading a statement from the state attorney general's office, confirming that Karen had pled guilty to all federal charges in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Meridian Development and their criminal associates. "Miss Westfield has agreed to forfeit all assets obtained through fraudulent means," Williams announced, including her home, which will be converted into a community legal aid center to help residents understand and protect their property rights. The financial restitution was staggering, in both its scope and its symbolic importance. Meridian Development faced federal penalties totaling to $5 million, with additional state fines that brought their total exposure to over $4 million in damages and penalties. A significant portion of that money would be used to establish a victim compensation fund for the families Karen had driven from their homes, while another portion would create an ongoing legal defense fund for rural property owners facing similar threats. But beyond the money, what moved me most was the formal apology the county issued to my family, acknowledging that local officials had failed to protect the Thornfield property from fraudulent claims and promising that such failures would never happen again. Emma's role in the victory celebration was both professional and deeply personal, and as she stood beside me during the ceremony, I realized that our partnership had evolved into something much more meaningful than a legal collaboration. "Your grandfather's vision of justice wasn't just about protecting one piece of land," she said during her remarks to the assembled crowd. "It was about creating a system where ordinary people can stand up to powerful interests and win through truth and determination rather than money and influence." The way she spoke about my grandfather, with such respect and understanding of his values, made me realize that she didn't just share my commitment to justice. She understood the deeper meaning of what we'd accomplished together. Later, as we walked along the lakeshore while the celebration continued behind us, she took my hand with a smile that suggested our future would include much more than just legal victories. The transformation of my property into the Silas Thornfield Memorial Community Garden was everything my grandfather could have hoped for, and more. We kept the essential character of the land unchanged: the old dock he'd built by hand, the willow trees he'd planted as a young man, the natural swimming area where he'd saved Roy's life decades earlier. But we added carefully planned walking trails and a small pavilion where families could gather for legitimate community events. The difference between this and Karen's fake community claims was stark and meaningful. Instead of taking the land through deception, we were sharing it through choice, and instead of enriching developers, we were creating a space that would benefit generations of local families. The opening ceremony drew over 200 people, including several families who'd been driven away by Karen's schemes and were now considering moving back to the area. Roy's speech at the dedication ceremony brought tears to more than a few eyes, including my own. "Silas Thornfield saved more than just my life that day in 1979, he said, his voice strong despite his obvious emotion. "He taught me that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves, and that justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about defending the values that make communities worth living in." As he spoke, I could almost feel my grandfather's presence, that quiet satisfaction he'd always shown when helping others, and I knew that this outcome would have made him proud not just of the victory, but of the way we'd achieved it through community building rather than revenge. The ripple effects of our success extended far beyond our small community. Within 6 months, the Property Rights Protection Act had passed both houses of the state legislature, creating new criminal penalties for HOA fraud and establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuse. Karen's former house, now the Lakeside Community Legal Center, was processing dozens of cases from families who'd previously felt powerless against HOA corruption. Emma had been appointed as the center's first director, a role that combined her legal expertise with her passion for helping ordinary people navigate complex property issues. The irony that Karen's own home had become a symbol of resistance to exactly the kind of abuse she'd perpetrated was so perfect it felt like my grandfather had planned it from beyond the grave. As I sat by the lake on a quiet evening 6 months after that first confrontational birthday party, watching families enjoy the community space we'd created, and thinking about the legislation that was protecting property owners across the state, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've honored the legacy of someone you loved. Grandpa Silas used to say, "Land belongs to those who know how to treasure it, not those who want to control it." Today, as I watched children playing on the grass where Karen had once planned a resort and families walking trails that would have been private club amenities under her scheme, I understood that he'd been right about more than just property rights. He'd been right about the power of community built on trust rather than fear, generosity rather than greed, and justice rather than manipulation. Sometimes we all feel powerless against bullies who hide behind authority and legal paperwork, wondering if justice only exists for those with money and connections. If you've ever been pushed around by an HOA, threatened by someone in power, or felt alone fighting for what's rightfully yours, this story proves you're not defenseless. At Loop Stories, I write these tales because I believe ordinary people deserve to see themselves winning against impossible odds. Your support means everything to this mission. So if this resonated with your struggles, please like and subscribe to help us reach others who need to hear they can fight back and win.
Appreciate you being here with Loop Stories. Some folks think HOA conflicts are just pretty neighbor disputes, but they can shake entire communities. We share the real dramas to remind everyone. Titles don't give you power, truth does. If you face injustice behind manicure lawns, you are not alone. Drop your thoughts below and join the resistance. One story at a time, we are leveling the playing field.